Napoleon Bonaparte, one of history's greatest army generals, went from ruling all of Europe to a tiny island in the Mediterranean and then to an even smaller island in the Atlantic. How did this happen and what if all of that changed? I researched many videos on this topic and I believe I have the most unique scenario, with a twist at the end that you wouldn't expect. To briefly explain to you the Napoleonic Wars, they were a series of many wars against France. I will not explore all of them, just the ones that are relevant for our scenario. Context is needed so you can understand the point of divergence better. I would describe the Napoleonic Wars in one sentence as: Napoleon tried to conquer Europe, he had some initial success, but invaded Russia and got betrayed by his allies, resulting in his defeat. At one point, Napoleon ruled most of Europe, establishing sister republics. These being de facto puppet governments, where Napoleon's relatives were the monarchs of their respective nations. What happened in most of the War of the Third Coalition doesn't concern us for this scenario. What is important is that Spain allied with France in 1804, because the British were harassing the Spanish Navy. The Spaniards, seeking protection, decided to join France, as this would deter Britain from attacking them, hopefully. Britain, on the other hand, was very strong at sea and had great economy. The British used these qualities to their advantage, disrupting the French overseas trading. Regarding the British economy, they used it to send money abroad to countries that were willing to go to war with Napoleon. The alliance between Spain and France was mutually beneficial for both sides, since the combined navy of both countries could rival the British one. This would make a naval invasion of the British Isles possible, most likely defeating Britain and ending the Napoleonic Wars once and for all. Unfortunately for Napoleon, on the 21st of October 1805, the British flag officer Horatio Nelson engaged the Spanish and French fleet at Trafalgar. Nelson did a very unorthodox move that was very risky, got killed in the process, but it was worth it, as the British fleet came out on top. This ensured British control over the seas, preventing Napoleon from ever being able to do a naval invasion in the British Isles. Here lies the first point of divergence I want to make. What if the naval battle of Trafalgar went a bit differently? The tactic used by Horatio Nelson was very risky. Perhaps his officers don't listen to him and refuse to carry out this suicidal attack. Or maybe the attack doesn't succeed and the British fleet is destroyed, giving the victory to France. This battle was decisive, as it ensured for the next 10 years that Napoleon couldn't invade Britain. Remember this event because I will use it in the alternate history part later. After the War of the Third Coalition, France had occupied British Hanover. The French initially offered Hanover to Prussia in exchange for an alliance. This agreement didn't go anywhere, as Hanover was returned to Britain. Right off the bat, we get to another point of divergence. This being, what if Hanover was transferred to Prussia instead? Would this secure an alliance and maybe help France win the war? I want to tell you more about the Napoleonic Wars before I hop to the alternate history part. This would give you more context for the situation and you can understand if Napoleon could ever be victorious. In the peace treaty, Napoleon also established the Confederation of the Rhine, which consists mainly of German speakers. This decision, together with returning Hanover to Britain, was a thorn in the side of the Prussians. Prussia felt betrayed, so they declared war on France on the 9th of October 1806, starting the War of the Fourth Coalition against France. The French performed very well, as always, due to Napoleon having superior tactics. His tactics relied on speed, where a decisive battle could be forced upon the enemy. He also split his army into the corps system, which he invented. Basically, the corps is like a mini army, having their own infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Another thing that Napoleon was good at was his strategy. He used a divide and conquer strategy, which worked very well for most of the Napoleonic Wars. Now that France and Prussia were at war, Russia, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and Sicily joined in to help Prussia. France, on the other hand, cut off their puppet states, which is the Confederation of the Rhine, Holland, Napoleonic Italy, Switzerland, and Spain. The French started chasing the Prussians and in the process took Berlin, the capital city of Prussia. The Prussians fled east, where they met with the Russians in East Prussia. The Battle of Eylau on February 7th up until February 8, 1807 was brutal for both sides. It took place during the winter in the freezing temperatures. France was ultimately victorious, but they suffered heavy casualties. As part of the peace treaties, France created the Continental System. What is the Continental System, you may ask? Well, let me tell you, since it's very important for the alternate history part. The Continental System was an embargo on British goods. It was forbidden for client states of the Continental System to trade with Britain as to not enrich them. The idea was to economically crumble the United Kingdom. So, who was in the Continental System? Well, after the War of the Fourth Coalition, it was all France's puppets I just mentioned, but also Spain and the Duchy of Warsaw, which just got created. Regarding territorial changes, Prussia lost over half of their territory, and out of that land, the Duchy of Warsaw was created. The Continental System was a very ambitious project which aimed to encourage French industrial development and to impoverish the British. Truth be told, British goods that were banned in the Continental System were usually of a lower price. This encouraged some members of the Continental System to sneakily trade with the British instead of with the overpriced French goods. One of these countries was Portugal, which got itself invaded in 1807 because they refused to join the Continental System. The idea was to force Portugal to join the Continental System. Spain, however, was breaking the agreement quite frequently and wanted to stop being allied with Napoleon. This is the reason why Napoleon would invade Spain, so the French can enforce their demands onto them, just like they did to Portugal. Since most of the French army was already in the Iberian Peninsula, they simply occupied some ports and major cities. As a result of that, the Spanish royal family was ousted, and the brother of Napoleon became the King of Spain. Napoleon expected the Spanish people to be happy that their incompetent monarchs were gone, but it didn't go as planned. The Spanish rebelled and the British invaded Portugal, starting the Peninsular War. This was a big deal and it weakened Napoleon's position in the continent of Europe. This war would continue for 7 more years, draining French resources and soldiers. The War of the Fifth Coalition was a brief one, with Napoleon defeating Austria in just a few months, where the Austrians would lose even more land. Most importantly, Napoleon married a daughter of the Austrian monarch, which made Austria join Napoleon's side. Napoleon ultimately invaded Russia in 1812. The reason for that is that Russia wasn't feeling like they were getting a fair deal working with France. After all, they were a major power, not a French puppet state, so the Russians felt that they should gain more out of this deal. To add insult to injury, the Duchy of Warsaw was a thorn in the Russian side, which strained relations with France. Also, due to the Continental System, Russia's economy was starting to fail. Eventually, the Russians slowly opened trade with the British. Speaking of 1912 and Russia, I have this very special coin. It's a 2 kopek coin, which is exactly 211 years old. It was made during the French invasion of Russia, which I find very interesting. Another interesting fact I can give you is that this exact coin was minted in the city of Yekaterinburg, beyond the Ural Mountains. The reason for that is that the Russians feared if they produced their coins in St. Petersburg, the capital of Russia, France might capture these coins. If the French got hold of these coins, they would become extremely wealthy. This is why they were made somewhere very remote. The French victory at Borodino against the Russians opened the way for the capture of Moscow, but it went nowhere as the French had to retreat due to the winter approaching. Out of the 650,000 French soldiers that went into Russia, only 100,000 returned to France. The Duchy of Warsaw was invaded, with Prussia and Austria switching sides. Even Sweden, which was ruled by one of Napoleon's generals, switched sides, attacking the French. This began the War of the Sixth Coalition. Austria was fed up that Napoleon wouldn't make any concessions to achieve peace, so the Austrians decided to abandon him and join the Sixth Coalition. Just to let you know, I have some banger upcoming videos, so make sure to subscribe if one of these topics interests you and you wouldn't want to miss it out. Napoleon had success in the front lines that he was fighting in. The problem was that Napoleon couldn't be everywhere at the same time. Where he fought, he won, but the other fronts were advancing towards Paris, the capital city of France. It was inevitable for Paris to fall, and when it did, Napoleon abdicated for the good of France. Louis XVI became the monarch of France, making the French Revolution pointless. Napoleon was exiled to Elba, but he returned. When he returned, his enemies declared war on him personally, not on France. Napoleon fought a decisive battle of Waterloo, where he was defeated and exiled to an even more remote island, ensuring that he wouldn't come back. This marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars, where both France and Napoleon were defeated. Napoleon and the French Revolution had lasting impacts on the whole continent of Europe. This is due to the idea of overthrowing your incompetent monarchs and establishing a unified state on linguistic lines. This concept was very popular in Germany and Italy, where nationalism was on the rise, allowing for these countries to unite in the future. What if all of that changed? Could we craft the perfect scenario where Napoleon comes out on top in the Napoleonic Wars? Let's find out how this could have happened. I mentioned this in the beginning of the video, but the Battle of Trafalgar was a crucial one for France. The British did something very risky and managed to defeat the Spanish and the French fleet. If this battle went a bit differently, then I bet that Britain would get destroyed at Trafalgar. This means that the Spanish and French fleet combined can rival the British Navy. This would allow France for a naval invasion of Britain, kicking them out of the war. France had the superior army, so if they landed in the British Isles, then the United Kingdom would for sure fall. This would be all or nothing for Napoleon. Knowing him, he might do this madness. This is because Napoleon was known for forcing decisive battles upon his enemies. While this scenario is very high risk and high reward for Napoleon, I will not explore the naval invasion of Britain in this video. This is because it would be too hard to predict if it would succeed or not. I can do something else that gives better odds for French victory in the Napoleonic Wars. This is the alliance between France and Prussia. I already explored the possibility of France giving Hanover to Prussia instead of returning it to Britain. If you remember earlier, I also told you that Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, which was primarily German-speaking. This was a great insult to Prussia, and bundled with the fact that Napoleon didn't give them Hanover, made Prussia invade. The Prussian invasion started the War of the Fourth Coalition, where several nations joined against Napoleon and his puppets. Assuming that an alliance can be secured between France and Prussia, the War of the Fourth Coalition wouldn't happen, or it would be very different. This is due to Prussia being the initiator of the conflict. If they are allied with France, it would make the war pointless. So, how can we secure this alliance? Hanover must go to Prussia, but what about the Confederation of the Rhine? Prussia would like to have all of it, since both are German speakers. I don't see Napoleon giving all of it up, but maybe a compromise is reached. To solve this issue, the Confederation of the Rhine would be split into two, North and South. Prussia is promised control over the northern Protestant part, with France keeping the southern Catholic part. Prussia would not directly annex these lands, at least not right away. They will be awarded to them after the conflicts are over. This is to ensure that Prussia doesn't just take these lands and switch sides. I assume that Russia would attack France and Prussia as a result of them keeping the balance of power intact. Sweden, Britain and Sicily would also join in as they did in our timeline, with France calling in on their respective allies. We would have a similar battle as the one in Eylau, where there were heavy casualties, but ultimately France would come out on top. For the sake of not making stuff up, let's assume that we have a similar peace treaty in this war as we had in the War of the Fourth Coalition historically. This means that Russia would barely lose any land and the Continental System would be established. Russia would join the Continental System as compensation for them not losing any land. This would anger the German ally of France, who would have liked to expand into Russia, but for now, things would be kept under control. Austria would eventually also join due to the marriage between Napoleon and Francis II's daughter. The idea was that nobody would trade with the British, hopefully tanking their economy. This had some real success, but it was short-lived as I already mentioned. Also, the Continental System encouraged trade of all European nations with France, which would enrich the French. In reality, only if France was way more industrialized, this could have helped the situation. France just wasn't ready to supply all of Europe with their domestic goods. I already explored that France's allies were constantly breaking around the restrictions of the Continental System, choosing to trade with Britain instead. This is part of the reason why Napoleon invaded Spain and Russia. To prevent this, we need all of the members to be motivated to destroy Britain. I have a very interesting proposal and it's war. If these countries were directly at war with Britain or an ally of Britain, they would choose not to trade with the British. This would ensure France's allies' victory in the conflict. One suggestion I have is for France to invade the Ottoman Empire instead of Russia. The idea is that Russia and Austria would directly gain land, with Prussia being awarded the northern part of the Confederation of the Rhine. Spain can even get a protectorate in the Levant, Libya, or maybe even annex Portugal. This means that each French ally is motivated to achieve victory against the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire would for sure join the British, so France's allies would be motivated not to trade with Britain, as they wanted to partition the Ottomans. Hopefully, this move would yield a final economic blow to Britain. One more advantage of Prussia and France allying together is that the Duchy of Warsaw wouldn't be created. The Russians really despised the Polish state, since it put pressure on them to give independence to their Polish majority areas. Without Prussia and France going to war, the Duchy of Warsaw wouldn't be created, which would hopefully improve relations between France and Russia. As I said, historically, Spain and Russia were invaded because they didn't obey the Continental System. This is a very oversimplified explanation and there were many other reasons, but I will focus only on this. If Spain and Russia are at war with the United Kingdom, then they wouldn't trade with them, giving Napoleon no reason to invade. I don't think that the French really cared much about the Ottoman Empire, but it was an opportunity to distract their allies of their worsening economic situation due to the Continental System. This war didn't really matter to France, as long as it keeps their allies busy and not trading with the British. Hopefully, this would worsen the economic situation in Britain, where they would finally sue for peace. Since I said that France couldn't alone supply the whole continent of Europe with goods and that their industry was lacking, the Ottoman Empire's defeat could solve that. France would seize many factories and use them to supply the continent. France actually attacked the Ottoman Empire in 1798, where even Napoleon was sent as an army general there. The French secured most of Egypt, defeating the Mamluks. However, the Ottomans, with the British support, were able to repel the French from Egypt in 1801. One more thing that France could do is not invade Spain and put Napoleon's brother in charge. This decision started the Peninsular War, which lasted for 7 years. The monarchy in Spain was incompetent, but they would fight alongside France against Britain and the Ottoman Empire. Also, the Spanish would be happy due to them gaining Portugal and possibly some more land. Having explored the benefits of France invading the Ottoman Empire, let me tell you how a potential war would go. France would again invade Egypt, where they would be successful in taking it. The combined French and Spanish ships would blockade the Mediterranean, making it more difficult for Britain to reach their ally of the Ottoman Empire. Goods needed to travel from Britain all around Africa and until they reached the Ottoman Empire. An alternative is that goods are produced domestically in India, where they can reach the Ottoman Empire quicker. Either way, it's more inconvenient for the British. Russia would step into the Balkan Peninsula, where Bulgarians, Greeks and Serbians would cheer the Russian arrival. All of these nationalities were subjugated by the Ottoman Empire for about 400 years by that time, so it was an opportunity for them to gain independence. This independence would be granted by Russia. Of course, the Russians would like to install their favorable monarchs in charge. Austria would take most of modern-day Croatia and have a protectorate over Romania, which would get established by unifying Moldavia and Wallachia. Both Britain and the Ottoman Empire would be screwed, as their enemies were far superior on land. Sweden was an ally of Britain, but they were neutral in this conflict. The Russians would still invade them and seize Finland, but also Denmark, Norway and Prussia would get involved, gaining some more land. With the Ottoman Empire being the only ally of Britain in Europe, I assume that the British would explore a possibility of a peace deal. This is due to the Ottomans collapsing very quickly, which would leave Britain alone against all of Europe. I see the United Kingdom abandoning the Ottoman Empire and seizing some lands for themselves, finally ending the hostilities between them and France. As for the peace treaty, Napoleon would form many sister republics in what used to be the Ottoman Empire. Russia would expand into the Caucasus and liberate Bulgaria, Serbia and Greece. All the liberated countries would be allied to Russia, with Russian nobility becoming monarchs of the newly formed nations. Austria would gain Croatia and Bosnia, with a protectorate being established over in Romania. Prussia would get their promised lands out of the Confederation of the Rhine. Relations between France and the United Kingdom wouldn't be the best for decades to come. Britain would be completely isolated from the continent of Europe, so they would start expanding elsewhere. Historically, the British returned most of the Dutch colonies that were temporarily occupied. This is due to the Netherlands allying with France for the duration of the Napoleonic Wars. These colonies included Guyana, South Africa and Indonesia. With Britain being kicked out of the continent of Europe, I bet that they would get to keep all of Guyana and most importantly Indonesia. The Spanish Empire would get to live another day, as most of their colonies left when Napoleon invaded Spain. As for Portugal, they would become a government in exile in Brazil, as the Spanish had occupied their homeland. The South American continent would be very tense for the time being. The French were victorious and they managed to win the Napoleonic Wars in a semi-realistic fashion. But what's next? Their allies of Austria, Prussia and Russia had no more benefit working with Napoleon. I really wonder what would happen after that, as Britain is no longer focusing on the European continent. A war between all France's allies is possible, with the balance of power in Europe changing yet again. Let me know in the comments if you want to see part 2 of this scenario. I want to quickly mention San Marino. The small nation and France had good relations during the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon even offered to extend the size of San Marino as their needs. I made a video on this topic, regarding what if San Marino formed all of Italy. Watch it next if you want to see how this could have happened. See you there.